In the ashes of a broken empire, a wounded nation waited for a savior. Germany, once proud, now humiliated by the Treaty of Versailles, was drowning in chaos. Hunger and employment and anger filled the streets. From this turmoil, a man would rise, a man whose words would ignite both hope and destruction. His name, Adolf Hitler. Hitler wasn't born a monster. He was a failed artist from Austria, rejected by art schools, and scarred by his experiences in the First World War. But inside him, a fire burned, a fire of resentment and ambition. When Germany lost the Great War, Hitler felt it wasn't a military defeat, it was betrayal. He believed that traitors within Jews, communists, and politicians had stabbed Germany in the back. In 1919, he joined a small political group, the German Workers' Party. His speeches, filled with fury and charisma, hypnotized the crowds. People who had lost everything now found a reason to believe again. Within a few years, Hitler transformed that small group into the National Socialist German Workers' Party, or the Nazi Party. His vision was clear: rebuild Germany, crush the Treaty of Versailles, and create a pure Aryan nation that would rule for 1,000 years. But behind those words of pride lay a plan soaked in hatred. By 1933, Hitler's words had turned into power. The Nazis seized control of Germany, and the world began to change. The swastika flew above Berlin, and Hitler's voice echoed across Europe. The man who once stood in poverty now commanded a nation ready for war. The German people saw him as their savior. But in the shadows, the machinery of terror began to move. Political opponents were silenced, books were burned, and propaganda filled the airwaves. Germany was awakening, not to peace, but to the storm of war. As the world watched, few understood what was coming. The rise of Adolf Hitler was not just the story of one man. It was the story of how hate, fear, and despair can give birth to a nightmare. And soon, that nightmare would consume the entire world. Pause. Sound of thunder, marching soldiers, and distant radio chatter. This is how it began. The year was 1933. Germany had a new leader, and the world barely noticed. While nations celebrated peace after the horrors of World War I, a storm was silently gathering in the heart of Europe. Adolf Hitler promised rebirth, a new Germany that would rise from the ruins. To his people, he offered pride and jobs. To his enemies, he offered silence and fear. The Nazi regime quickly took control of every part of German life: schools, newspapers, even churches. Every word, every image, every song now served the Führer. But outside Germany, the world refused to see the danger. Britain and France were exhausted from the last war. The United States was deep in the Great Depression. The League of Nations, created to protect peace, stood powerless. Hitler began to test the world's patience. He rearmed the German military, violating the Treaty of Versailles. New tanks, planes, and weapons filled the factories. When he marched his troops into the demilitarized Rhineland in 1936, it was an open act of defiance. The Allies could have stopped him then. A single warning, a single strike, but they did nothing. In Berlin, Hitler watched the world silence and smiled. He realized something crucial: no one would stop him. At home, his image became godlike. Propaganda minister Joseph Goebbels filled the airwaves with glory, showing Hitler as Germany's savior. Children were taught to salute, women were told to serve, and men were trained to fight. The Nazi machine was moving, powerful, efficient, unstoppable. But Hitler wanted more than power. He wanted space. He called it Lebensraum, or living room, land for the German people to expand. His eyes turned east, toward Poland, Czechoslovakia, and Russia. But first, he would take Austria. In March 1938, the German army rolled into Vienna. No shots fired, no resistance. The world watched again, and remained silent. Crowds cheered in the streets, waving swastikas and flowers. Austria had fallen, not by war, but by welcome. This was Hitler's genius, and the world's greatest mistake. Every unchecked move made him stronger. Every silence gave him courage. By the time the world would open its eyes, it would already be too late. Pause. The sound of cheering crowds fades into ominous drums. The world had its chance to stop Hitler, but it chose peace over warning. By 1938, Europe was standing on the edge of an abyss. Hitler had tasted power, and he wanted more. Austria had fallen without a fight. Now, his eyes turned to Czechoslovakia, a young nation carved from the ruins of World War I inside. It lived millions of ethnic Germans, and Hitler demanded they be returned to his Reich. He claimed it was about protecting his people, but the truth was far darker. It was about expansion, domination, and revenge. The world once again faced a choice: stand up to tyranny or surrender to fear. British Prime Minister Neville Chamberlain, desperate to avoid another war, chose negotiation. In September 1938, at the Munich Conference, Hitler sat across from the leaders of Britain, France, and Italy. He promised that if he got part of Czechoslovakia, the Sudetenland, he would ask for nothing more. Chamberlain believed him. The agreement was signed. Hitler got his land without firing a single bullet. When Chamberlain returned to London, he waved a piece of paper and declared, "Peace for our time." But peace had already died in Munich. Inside Germany, Hitler laughed. He called the Western leaders worms. To him, their weakness was proof that he could take the whole world piece by piece. By March 1939, his promise was broken. German tanks rolled into the rest of Czechoslovakia, crushing the illusion of peace forever. The world began to wake up, but too late. Britain and France finally drew a line. If Germany attacked Poland, there would be war. Hitler didn't care. In secret, he made a shocking deal with his sworn enemy, Joseph Stalin, leader of the Soviet Union. The Molotov-Ribbentrop Pact, a pact of evil, divided Eastern Europe between them. It guaranteed that when Hitler struck Poland, the Soviets would stay silent. At dawn on September 1 Street, 1939, the sky over Poland roared with the thunder of German planes. Cities were bombed, civilians slaughtered, soldiers overwhelmed by a force the world had never seen before. Blitzkrieg, or lightning war. Within weeks, Poland was gone. Britain and France declared war. World War II had begun. The dream of a thousand-year Reich was now marching into fire. Pause. Sounds of air raid sirens and bombs falling fade into silence. What started as one man's ambition had become the world's nightmare. September 1939. Europe is once again at war. But this was not the war the world remembered. This was something new, something terrifying. The Germans called it Blitzkrieg, lightning war. It wasn't just an attack. It was a storm of speed, power, and precision. Tanks, aircraft, and infantry moved as one, smashing through enemy lines before they could even react. In Poland, the world saw Blitzkrieg for the first time. Within days, the Polish army collapsed. The Luftwaffe rained bombs from above while the panzers tore through towns below. Civilians fled in panic. Cities burned. And when the smoke cleared, Poland was gone, divided between Hitler's Germany and Stalin's Soviet Union. The West declared war, but they didn't act. Britain and France waited behind the Maginot Line, convinced that the war would stay far away. It was called the Phony War. Months of silence before the storm. But Hitler had no intention of waiting. He was already planning his next move. In April 1940, the Nazi war machine struck again, this time at Denmark and Norway. The world was stunned by how fast the nations fell. Then came the true invasion, Western Europe. In May 1940, German tanks rolled into Belgium, the Netherlands, and France. The Allies were caught off guard. Blitzkrieg thundered across Europe. Town after town fell as the Wehrmacht swept through the continent with unstoppable force. The French army, once the pride of Europe, was crushed in 6 weeks. Paris, the city of light, fell under Nazi control. British soldiers barely escaped through the beaches of Dunkirk, rescued by a fleet of civilian boats. For Hitler, it was the moment of triumph. He stood before the Eiffel Tower, smiling, victorious. Europe belonged to him. But across the English Channel, one nation still stood: Britain. Hitler turned his gaze to the island nation that refused to surrender. He ordered his generals to prepare Operation Sea Lion, the invasion of Britain. But before his troops could cross the Channel, Germany had to control the skies. Thus began the next great battle, one that would determine the fate of Europe itself. Sound fades into the roar of aircraft engines and distant explosions. The Blitzkrieg had conquered Europe. Now, it was coming for Britain. Summer 1940. Europe was under Hitler's boots. France had fallen. Poland was gone. Norway and Denmark were conquered. Only one nation now stood alone: Britain. For Hitler, the next step was clear: Operation Sea Lion, the invasion of the British Isles. But before his armies could cross the English Channel, he had to destroy Britain's first line of defense, the Royal Air Force. The Battle of Britain had begun. From the skies over London, Dover, and the English countryside, the fate of the free world was about to be decided. The Luftwaffe, Germany's air force, launched massive attacks on airfields, radar stations, and cities. Waves of bombers filled the skies, escorted by deadly Messerschmitt fighters. But the British stood firm. Young pilots of the RAF, many barely in their 20s, rose into the sky in their Spitfires and Hurricanes. They were outnumbered, outgunned, but not out of courage. Day after day, they fought against impossible odds. Dogfights turned the skies into fields of fire and smoke. Pause. Softer tone. Prime Minister Winston Churchill watched his nation under siege. Yet, he refused to break. His voice became Britain's greatest weapon. He declared, "We shall fight on the beaches. We shall fight on the landing grounds. We shall never surrender." When Hitler failed to crush the RAF, he grew desperate. He turned his wrath toward the people themselves. In September 1940, the Blitz began. Night after night, German bombers dropped fire over London, Coventry, and other cities. The skyline burned red. Civilians took shelter in underground stations, singing songs to keep their spirits alive. But Britain did not fall. The radar system, the bravery of the pilots, and the unity of the people turned the tide. By October, the Luftwaffe was bleeding. Hitler postponed the invasion indefinitely. For the first time, the Nazi war machine had been stopped. For the first time, the world saw that Hitler could be defeated. Churchill's words echoed through history. Never in the field of human conflict was so much owed by so many to so few. The Battle of Britain was over. Britain still stood scarred, but unbroken. Sound fades with air raid sirens turning into a calm wind. The skies of Europe were silent once more, but the war was far from over. The year was 1941. Britain still stood defiant, and Hitler's dream of conquering the West had stalled. But in his mind, the true enemy had always been waiting in the East. Behind the vast plains of Europe lay a giant, the Soviet Union. To Hitler, it was a land of inferior races, ruled by communists he despised. But more than hatred, there was ambition. He wanted the Soviet oil fields, the farmlands of Ukraine, and the endless resources that could fuel his empire for 1,000 years. Despite the non-aggression pact he had signed with Stalin, Hitler's obsession with destroying the Soviet Union grew uncontrollable. In secret, he prepared the largest invasion force in human history, Operation Barbarossa. On June 22, 1941, as the sun rose, over 3 million German soldiers, backed by tanks, artillery, and aircraft, crossed into Soviet territory. The attack stretched from the Baltic Sea to the Black Sea. It was the beginning of the greatest and bloodiest battlefront in history. At first, the Soviet Union was caught completely off guard. German panzers encircled entire Soviet armies. Cities fell one after another: Minsk, Smolensk, Kiev. Millions of prisoners marched west, their faces hollow, their spirits broken. For Hitler, it seemed like victory was certain, but he underestimated one thing: Russia's endurance. As the German army advanced deeper, the land itself turned against them. Roads became mud, supplies ran thin, and with every mile, the Soviet resistance grew stronger. The Germans had expected a quick victory, but they found themselves fighting both the Red Army and the Russian winter. In December 1941, snow began to fall. Temperatures dropped below -30 degrees. Engines froze. Weapons jammed. The same soldiers who once marched proudly into Moscow now struggled to survive. Then came the counterattack. The Red Army, reinforced and relentless, struck back. The Germans for the first time were forced to retreat. Hitler refused to accept it. He raged, he screamed. He ordered his men to hold every inch of ground. But history had turned. The invincible Wehrmacht had met its match. Pause. The sound of icy wind and distant artillery fades in. The snows of Russia buried more than men. They buried Hitler's dream of world domination. Winter, 1941. The German army had failed to take Moscow, but in the north, Hitler's forces turned their fury toward another great Soviet city, Leningrad, the city of Lenin, a symbol of Soviet pride, and Hitler wanted it erased from the map. In September 1941, German and Finnish forces surrounded Leningrad completely, cutting off all roads, railways, and supplies. What followed was not just a siege, it was a slow death, stretching for 900 days. Inside the city, nearly 3 million civilians were trapped. Winter came early, harsh and merciless. There was no food, no fuel, no light. People burned furniture to stay warm. They ate wallpaper paste, rats, even sawdust bread. By the end of the first winter, over 500,000 people had died not from bombs, but from hunger and cold. Pause. Somber music tone. Yet, even in despair, the spirit of Leningrad refused to die. Orchestras played symphonies in freezing halls. Artists painted. Teachers taught children in basements. And the Red Army fought with everything. They had to keep the supply routes open, including the legendary Road of Life, a frozen path across Lake Ladoga, where trucks carried food and hope to the starving city. German bombers tried to destroy it, but every night, Soviet drivers risked their lives to cross that icy road, bringing just enough to keep the city breathing. Hitler believed Leningrad would fall within weeks. Instead, the siege lasted for 2.5 years. The Germans bombed the city daily, but they could not break it. The people of Leningrad endured the unendurable. They buried their dead in frozen ground and still refused to surrender. By 1943, the tide of war began to turn. The Soviet army launched massive counterattacks. And in January 1944, after 872 days of suffering, the siege was finally broken. Leningrad was in ruins. Over 1 million civilians were dead. But the Nazi plan to destroy the city had failed. Pause. Soft, emotional tone. In the ashes of their suffering, the people of Leningrad had proven something to the world, that courage and endurance can survive even the darkest of winters. 1942. Hitler's army still controlled most of Europe, but in the east, the war was about to reach its most brutal and decisive chapter. Its name would be remembered forever: Stalingrad. Hitler wanted the city not only for its strategic position on the Volga River, but because of its name, Stalin's city. To capture it would be both a military victory and a personal humiliation for his greatest rival. In the summer of 1942, the German Sixth Army, led by General Friedrich Paulus, marched toward Stalingrad. Bombers from the Luftwaffe reduced the city to rubble. Thousands of civilians were killed as entire districts burned to ashes. Yet, amid the ruins, the Soviet soldiers refused to retreat. The battle turned the city into hell itself. Every building, every street, every staircase became a battlefield. The Soviet defenders, known as the Rats of Stalingrad, fought from the shadows of broken factories, sewers, and basements. The Germans advanced by day, but the Soviets struck back by night. Hitler ordered his men to take the city at any cost, but the cost was unbearable. By November, the German army was stretched thin, their supply lines cut, and the freezing cold returned. Then came the Soviet counterattack, Operation Uranus. Over 1 million Red Army soldiers surrounded Stalingrad, trapping 300,000 Germans inside the ruins. Paulus requested permission to retreat. Hitler refused. He told him, "The Sixth Army will stand fast." As food and ammunition ran out, the German soldiers starved and froze. They fought in cellars, scavenged for scraps, and waited for reinforcements that never came. By January 1943, it was over. Paulus, promoted to field marshal by Hitler, surrendered rather than die for a lost cause. Over 90,000 German soldiers were taken prisoner. Only 5,000 would ever return home. Stalingrad was in ruins, but it was a symbol of defiance. It showed the world that the Nazi war machine could bleed, and it could be beaten. Pause. Somber tone fades into hope. Hitler's greatest army had been destroyed. The tide of World War II had turned. From that frozen city on the Volga, the downfall of the Third Reich had begun. while the snows of Russia buried armies in the east. Another war raged beneath the burning sun of North Africa. It was a different battlefield, endless sand, scorching heat, and blinding light. Here, tanks replaced trenches, and the fight for control of the desert would decide the fate of the Mediterranean. At the heart of it all stood one-man Field Marshal Erwin Rommel, the Desert Fox. Rommel was unlike any other Nazi commander. Clever, daring, and respected even by his enemies, he became a legend of the desert. Leading the Afrika Corps, he outmaneuvered the British forces again and again. His tactics were fast, unpredictable, and devastating, echoing the same blitzkrieg fury that had conquered Europe. In 1941, the Germans swept across Libya and Egypt, pushing the British back toward the Nile. Rommel's tanks struck like lightning, their engines roaring across the dunes. To his soldiers, he was a hero. To the Allies, he was a nightmare. But Rommel's brilliance couldn't change one truth. The desert devoured everything. Supply lines stretched thin across hundreds of miles. Fuel and food were as deadly a weapon as bullets. Hitler promised reinforcements that never arrived. Then came a new British commander, General Bernard Montgomery. He was calm, patient, and determined to stop the Desert Fox once and for all. At El Alamein, in late 1942, the two men clashed in one of the most decisive battles of the war. For 12 days, the desert exploded with fire. Tanks clashed, mines detonated, and artillery thundered through the night. But this time, the British had the numbers, the supplies, and the skies. On November 4, 1942, Rommel was forced to retreat. It was the first great victory for the Allies, and the beginning of the end for Hitler's dreams in Africa. A few months later, American forces landed in Morocco and Algeria. The Desert Front collapsed, and by May 1943, the last German soldiers in Africa surrendered. Pause. Reflective tone. Rommel would later return to Europe not as a conqueror, but as a man caught in the chaos of a crumbling Reich. Even his loyalty to Hitler would be tested. But that part of his story would come later. For now, the Desert War was over. The sun had set on the Nazi Empire in Africa. While armies clashed on land, another silent war raged across the vast oceans. The Battle of the Atlantic. It was not fought with tanks or aircraft, but with steel, stealth, and courage. At stake was the lifeline of Britain, the sea routes that brought food, weapons, and hope from America. If Hitler could choke these routes, Britain would starve and fall. The weapon of choice, the German U-boat, sleek, deadly, and invisible beneath the waves. They were called the Grey Wolves. Hunting in packs, they waited in the dark, ready to strike at the convoys that crossed the Atlantic. When the torpedoes hit, ships vanished in seconds. Flames lit the ocean. Men clung to wreckage, crying out in the freezing water. The sea became a graveyard of steel and souls. By 1941, the U-boats were winning. Hundreds of Allied ships had been sunk. Supplies grew scarce. Britain stood on the brink, but the Allies adapted. New technology, radar, sonar, depth charges, and long-range aircraft began to turn the tide. Convoys traveled in tight formation, escorted by destroyers and corvettes that hunted the hunters. Every voyage became a deadly game of hide and seek, played across thousands of miles of ocean. Tone shifts from fear to hope. Then, in 1943, the balance finally broke. Allied codebreakers cracked the German naval communications, the Enigma code. Now, every move of the U-boats could be tracked, every ambush avoided. The hunters had become the hunted. German submarines began to fall one by one, sunk in the deep Black Sea they once ruled. The Atlantic, the vital artery of the Allied world, was safe once more. But the cost was terrible. Over 30,000 U-boat crewmen never returned to the surface. Tens of thousands of Allied sailors vanished beneath the waves. Pause. Sound of distant ocean, calm but haunting. The Battle of the Atlantic lasted nearly the entire war. It was not a battle of glory, but of endurance. It decided who would feed their people and who would fall to hunger. In the end, it was the courage of those unseen men, fighting beneath the waves and above them, that kept the world alive. December 7th, 1941, a day that would change the world forever. As the sun rose over the Pacific, peace still lingered in the waters of Pearl Harbor, Hawaii. American sailors went about their morning routines, unaware that death was already descending from the sky. At 7:55 a.m., the world exploded. Japanese aircraft, flying low from the north, unleashed a storm of destruction. Torpedoes sliced through the calm harbor. Bombs rained down on battleships anchored in neat rows ships with names that echoed American pride. Arizona, Oklahoma, California. In minutes, the harbor was a blazing inferno. The USS Arizona erupted in a massive fireball, her hull torn open, her crew trapped inside. Smoke and flames turned the morning sky black. Men screamed for help, diving into burning, oil-covered waters. It was an attack so sudden, so devastating, that it stunned an entire nation. Pause low, emotional music begins. More than 2,400 Americans were killed, hundreds of aircraft destroyed, the Pacific Fleet crippled, but the Japanese, in their triumph, had awakened a sleeping giant. The next day, President Franklin D. Roosevelt stood before Congress and declared, "Yesterday, December 7, 1941, a date which will live in infamy, the United States of America was suddenly and deliberately attacked. The United States was now at war, and with America's entry, World War II became truly global. Hitler vs. The world was no longer a metaphor, it was reality." Germany and Italy, allies of Japan under the Axis Pact, declared war on America. In response, the industrial might of the United States roared to life. Factories that once built cars now built tanks, bombers, and battleships. Young men enlisted by the millions, ready to fight across oceans and continents. Tone shifts slow, powerful. For Hitler, this was both opportunity and disaster. He believed the US would take years to rise, but America, united in fury, would become the greatest war machine in history. Across Europe, the Allies felt hope return. The tide of war was turning slowly, but surely. From the ashes of Pearl Harbor rose a new determination, a new front, and a new world order. The war that began with the dictator's ambition now belonged to all humanity. By the summer of 1942, the war had devoured continents, but nowhere burned brighter or darker than the Eastern Front. After the failure to capture Moscow, Hitler turned his eyes to the south. His new target, Stalingrad, a city that bore the name of his greatest enemy, Joseph Stalin. To Hitler, it was more than a city. It was a symbol. To conquer it would humiliate the Soviet Union. But Stalingrad was not just a name, it was a nightmare waiting to happen. The German Sixth Army, over 300,000 strong, advanced across the steppes, confident in victory. The Luftwaffe rained fire from above, reducing the city to rubble. By September, Stalingrad was a smoking wasteland, a city of ruins where every street became a battlefield. The Soviets refused to surrender. They fought building by building, room by room, even floor by floor. Snipers waited in silence. Grenades were thrown through holes in walls. The Volga River, once calm, ran red with blood. Voice lowers heavy, dramatic. Hitler ordered his generals, no retreat, no surrender. But Stalin's order was the same, not one step back. The result, a hell on earth. In freezing temperatures below 30 C, German soldiers starved and froze. Supplies ran out. Ammunition dwindled. The once invincible Wehrmacht was trapped in a steel ring. Soviet forces had encircled the city. Operation Uranus had snapped shut like a trap. Inside the pocket, the Germans clung to survival. They ate rats, burned books for warmth, buried their dead in frozen ground. Hitler refused to allow retreat. He promised airlifts, reinforcements, but they never came. By February 1943, the once mighty Sixth Army ceased to exist. Over 90,000 men surrendered, skeletal, frostbitten, and broken. Only a few thousand would ever return to Germany. Pause, wind howls, silence follows. Stalingrad was more than a battle. It was the turning point of the war. The myth of the invincible German army was shattered. For the first time, Hitler's dream of domination began to crumble. From that frozen ruin on the Volga, the Red Army would begin its relentless march westward, all the way to Berlin. Tone ends softly, voice echoes like history itself. And Stalingrad would forever remain the city that broke the backbone of the Nazi Empire. While Europe burned and Russia froze, Another war raged across the endless sands of North Africa. Here, the battle was fought, not in cities or forests, but in the desert, where the sun scorched the earth and the horizon never ended. At the center of it all stood one man, Erwin Rommel, the Desert Fox. Rommel was no ordinary general. He was daring, fast, and brilliant, a master of surprise and maneuver. Leading the Afrika Corps, he struck like lightning across Libya and Egypt, pushing back the British forces with devastating speed. The desert became his chessboard. Every sand dune, every mirage was a move in his deadly game. His tanks, the Panzer divisions, sliced through Allied lines. Even his enemies admired him. But Rommel's genius was not enough to overcome the vast distances, the supply shortages, and the relentless will of the Allies. Tone shifts tense and heroic. By 1942, the tide began to change. British forces, under a new commander, General Bernard Montgomery, prepared to strike back. The battle would take place near a small railway halt in Egypt, a name that would echo through history, El Alamein. For 12 days, the desert thundered with explosions. Shells lit up the night sky. The sand turned to glass under the heat of battle. The British Eighth Army advanced steadily, cutting off Rommel's fuel lines and shattering his formations. Finally, Montgomery's forces broke through. Rommel, outnumbered and out of supplies, had no choice but to retreat. It was the first great land victory for the Allies, a turning point in the Desert War. Voice softens reflective tone. Winston Churchill would later say, "Before Alamein, we never had a victory. After Alamein, we never had a defeat." For Hitler, the loss was personal. Rommel had been his favorite general, a symbol of German brilliance. But the defeat in Africa marked the end of Nazi expansion beyond Europe. By May 1943, the last Axis troops in Tunisia surrendered. The desert that once shimmered with the promise of conquest now lay silent, littered with rusting tanks and memories of men who fought under a burning sun. The war in Africa was over, but from those sands, a new front was about to rise, a return to Europe itself. By 1943, the tide of war was turning. From the deserts of Africa, the Allies looked north toward Europe's soft underbelly, Italy. The goal was clear: strike at Mussolini's fascist regime, weaken Hitler's southern flank, and open a path to Germany itself. But Italy was no easy target. Behind its beauty lay mountains, narrow roads, and fierce German defenses. Music rises suspenseful. In July 1943, Operation Husky began, the largest amphibious invasion ever attempted up to that time. Under cover of darkness, Allied ships crossed the Mediterranean and landed on the beaches of Sicily. American and British troops stormed ashore as German and Italian forces scrambled to respond. After weeks of fierce fighting through the Sicilian hills, the Allies prevailed. Sicily fell, and so did Benito Mussolini. The once mighty dictator, who had dreamed of a new Roman Empire, was betrayed by his own government. He was arrested as Italy turned against him. For the first time since the war began, one of Hitler's major allies had collapsed. But the war in Italy was far from over. Hitler reacted swiftly. German troops poured into northern Italy, rescuing Mussolini and establishing a puppet regime, the so-called Italian Social Republic. The Allies pressed on, landing at Salerno and then Anzio, facing brutal counterattacks from German forces entrenched in the mountains. The Italian campaign became a bloody grind. Every hill, every village, soaked in sacrifice. Voice softens reflective tone. Rome, the eternal city, was finally liberated in June 1944. Crowds wept in the streets as Allied tanks rolled past ancient ruins. For the Italians, it was both an end and a beginning. The fall of fascism, but the start of rebuilding from ashes. Mussolini's dream had died. His empire reduced to rubble, his army broken, his people exhausted. He would spend his final days hunted, hiding, and doomed, a fallen dictator in a crumbling world. Tone darkens, thunder rumble, a slow fade. The fall of Italy sent a message to the world. Even the strongest dictatorships can collapse from within. And as Hitler watched his ally fall, he knew his own empire was beginning to crack. June 6, 1944, a date forever written in history. D-Day, the day when the free world struck back. For years, Hitler's armies had ruled Europe behind a wall of steel and fear. But on this morning, the world came for him. Across the English Channel, under the cover of darkness, an armada unlike anything ever seen gathered. 5,000 ships, 11,000 aircraft, and 156,000 men. They came from America, Britain, Canada, and countless occupied nations. Their mission, to break Hitler's Atlantic Wall and liberate Europe. Sound of wind and waves grows louder, then explosions, gunfire. As dawn broke, the first landing crafts approached the beaches of Normandy. Names that would live forever: Omaha, Utah, Gold, Juno, Sword. The sea turned red. Men jumped into the cold surf, bullets whistling past. Machine guns roared from concrete bunkers as soldiers clawed their way up the sand. Inch by inch, bodies fell, but the line never broke. Voice steady, emotional. On Omaha Beach, American troops faced hell itself. Waves of fire cut down entire platoons. Yet still, they advanced, dragging the wounded, charging through barbed wire, storming the cliffs above. By nightfall, the impossible had been done. The Allies had a foothold in France. Hitler's fortress of Europe had been breached. Behind the chaos lay years of planning and deception. Operation Overlord and Operation Fortitude, which convinced the Germans that the invasion would come at Calais, not Normandy. Even as the beaches burned, Hitler refused to believe the truth. Voice rises, hopeful tone. From that day forward, the liberation of Europe had begun. Villages that had known only fear now heard the thunder of freedom. Rolling across the fields, the swastika would soon fall, one town, one city, one sacrifice at a time. Soft music fades in melancholic yet triumphant. But D-Day came at a cost. Over 10,000 Allied soldiers were killed, wounded, or missing. The beaches of Normandy became both a grave and a promise. That tyranny would not last forever. Final line, delivered slowly, powerfully. It was, as history would remember, the longest day. And from its dawn began the end of Hitler's dark empire. After D-Day, the Allied advance across France was fierce and unstoppable. For 4 long years, the swastika had flown over Paris, the heart of Europe, a symbol of Hitler's domination. But now, the tide of freedom was rolling toward the city once called the light of the world. Soft orchestral build mixed with distant gunfire. The road to Paris was not easy. German forces fought fiercely across Normandy's hedgerows and the plains of northern France. The Allies' American, British, Canadian, and Free French troops pushed forward relentlessly. Towns and villages were liberated one after another. People wept in the streets, waving flags that had been hidden since 1940. By August 1944, the Allied command faced a decision: bypass Paris or risk everything to free it. But for the French resistance, waiting in the shadows, there was no choice. They rose up in open rebellion. Gunfire echoed in the narrow streets. Barricades went up. The people of Paris were fighting for their city's soul. Music intensifies, tension builds. Then came the moment. On August 25, 1944, General Philippe Leclerc's 2nd Armored Division, along with the U.S. 4th Infantry, entered the capital. German Commander General Dietrich von Choltitz had orders from Hitler to destroy Paris, to burn its monuments, flood its streets, and leave nothing but ashes. But in an act of quiet defiance, he refused. The guns fell silent. The bells of Notre Dame rang once more. Crowds flooded the boulevards, cheering and crying as Allied tanks rolled past the Eiffel Tower. Men embraced soldiers. Women handed flowers. The nightmare of occupation was over. Voice softens, emotional. General Charles de Gaulle marched down the Champs-Élysées, declaring before the world, Paris, Paris outraged, Paris broken, Paris martyred, but Paris liberated. For France, it was not only freedom, it was rebirth. The city that had suffered in silence now sang again, and the flame of liberty, nearly extinguished, blazed back to life. Pause, soft strings fade in. But for Hitler, the loss of Paris was more than military defeat. It was humiliation. His dream of a 1,000-year Reich was collapsing. The Allies were now closing in from west and south, and in the east, The Red Army was marching across Europe like a storm. The walls of Hitler's empire were beginning to crumble piece by piece, city by city. While the Allies liberated France from the west, a storm was rising in the east. From the ruins of Stalingrad and the snows of Moscow, the Red Army had transformed from a beaten force into an unstoppable machine of vengeance. This was not just a counterattack. It was retribution. Drums beat slowly, echoing. By 1944, the Soviet advance had become a tidal wave sweeping westward. Cities that once fell to Hitler's blitzkrieg were reclaimed one by one: Kiev, Minsk, Warsaw, Riga. Every step forward was soaked in blood. For the German soldiers, this was a nightmare come alive. The same lands they had once conquered now became killing grounds. Villages burned. Forests echoed with gunfire. The hunter had become the hunted. Tone lowers grim and emotional. The Soviets, hardened by years of suffering, showed no mercy. Entire divisions of the Wehrmacht were crushed in massive encirclements. The skies were filled with Soviet planes, their red stars blazing against the clouds. The roar of T-34 tanks echoed across the plains. The greatest of these offensives came in the summer of 1944. Operation Bagration. It destroyed the German Army Group Center. Over 400,000 soldiers lost in a single campaign. The Eastern Front collapsed. In a matter of months, Soviet troops reached the borders of Poland and the gates of Germany itself. Voice sharpens, intensity rises. For Hitler, it was a disaster. He screamed at his generals, demanded impossible victories, and blamed everyone but himself. Berlin's propaganda still claimed triumph, but reality had turned against the Reich. The people of Eastern Europe suffered the most. Their lands became battlefields once again, caught between two great powers fighting for domination. Cities like Warsaw rose in rebellion, only to be crushed in fire and silence. Music builds dark but heroic. The Red Army pushed forward relentlessly. They fought not only for their homeland, but for vengeance. For Leningrad's starving millions. For the villages burned by the SS. For the murdered, the enslaved, the forgotten. Every mile they advanced brought them closer to Berlin, and to the man who had unleashed hell upon the world. Voice slows, cold, heavy pause. By the end of 1944, the red flag was flying over half of Eastern Europe. Hitler's empire was collapsing from within and without. The wolves he had sent east had returned, and they were at his door. By the end of 1944, Hitler's empire was dying. The Allies pressed from the west, the Soviets from the east, but the Führer refused to surrender. In one final act of defiance, he planned a bold strike, a desperate gamble that he believed could turn back the tide. This was the Battle of the Bulge. Soft snare drums begin, growing louder. In December 1944, under cover of fog and snow, 250,000 German soldiers launched a surprise attack through the dense forests of the Ardennes. In Belgium, their goal: split the Allied armies, capture the port of Antwerp, and force the Western powers to negotiate. The plan was daring and suicidal. At first, it worked. American lines were caught off guard. Columns of panzers and SS divisions smashed through the front, creating a massive bulge in the Allied line. The winter sky thundered with artillery. Snow turned black with smoke and blood. Voice deepens, gritty tone. In the small town of Bastogne, American paratroopers of the 101st Airborne Division found themselves surrounded, outnumbered, low on food, ammunition, and hope. When the Germans demanded their surrender, General Anthony McAuliffe gave a one-word reply: nuts. That single word became the symbol of Allied defiance. Music builds heroic rise. Despite brutal cold and relentless attacks, the Americans held firm, and soon, the skies cleared, allowing Allied aircraft to strike back. Thousands of bombers filled the air, pounding German supply lines and armor. The tide turned once more. General George S. Patton, moving faster than anyone thought possible, swung his entire army north to relieve Bastogne. The German advance ground to a halt. By January 1945, the bulge was gone, and with it, the last of Hitler's reserves. He had gambled everything and lost. Voice softens, reflective, dark. Germany's young men lay frozen in the snow, their tanks burnt out, their fuel gone. The once mighty Wehrmacht was broken beyond repair. Hitler's final hope of victory had vanished in the cold Ardennes winter. From now on, the war would only move in one direction, toward Berlin. Pause, faint wind, fading drums, and deep beneath the Reich Chancellery, Hitler began preparing for the end, an end that would come sooner than anyone imagined. April 1945. The world was closing in on Berlin, once the proud capital of the Third Reich. It was now a shattered city of ruins, smoke, and despair. Hitler, once the master of Europe, now hid beneath it, in a concrete bunker 20 feet underground. Above him, the city burned. The Red Army was at the gates, their artillery shaking the ground day and night. Every explosion drew closer. Voice lowers slow, cold. The streets of Berlin had become a battlefield. Civilians, old men, women, even children were forced into the Volkssturm, the People's Army. Armed with rifles and fear, they faced the full might of the Soviet war machine. There was no hope, only fanatic orders from a man lost in madness. Inside the Führerbunker, Hitler raged. He accused his generals of betrayal, his allies of cowardice, his people of weakness. Reality had vanished for him. He still spoke of victory, of miracle weapons, of divisions that no longer existed. Somber piano tone fades in, but even in this darkness, the end was undeniable. On April 20th, his 56th birthday, Hitler emerged briefly into the ruined garden of the Chancellery. He shook the hands of boy soldiers, children of 15, trembling and terrified. It was the last time he would ever be seen in daylight. Music darkens, heavy bass rumble. As Soviet tanks closed in, he married his longtime companion, Eva Braun, in a brief ceremony inside the bunker. A day later, on April 30th, 1945, Adolf Hitler ended his life with a gunshot. Eva followed him with poison. The bodies were carried outside, doused in gasoline, and burned. A pitiful end to the man who had set the world on fire. Pause. Faint crackle of fire, then silence. Above ground, the Red Army stormed the Reichstag, raising the red flag over the ruins of Berlin. The Third Reich, the empire Hitler promised would last 1,000 years, had fallen in just 12. Voice softens, reflective. When the gunfire finally stopped, the cost of his madness was revealed. Over 70 million lives lost, cities erased, nations scarred forever. Berlin lay in ashes. Germany was divided, and the world stood, silent and broken, staring into the ruins of what hate had built. The war in Europe was over, but its echoes would haunt humanity forever. The guns finally fell silent. May 1945, the war in Europe was over. For the first time in 6 long years, the world could breathe again. But the silence was not peace. It was mourning. Cities across the continent lay in ruins. London, Warsaw, Stalingrad, Berlin, all shattered by the fury of total war. Millions were dead. Millions more were homeless, lost, or broken beyond recognition. The world looked upon the devastation and asked one question: how did humanity let this happen? Soft piano begins, melancholic tone. In the ashes of the Third Reich, the Allies uncovered horrors beyond imagination. The concentration camps, Auschwitz, Treblinka, Dachau, where 6 million Jews and countless others were murdered. The gates of hell had been opened, and the truth burned itself into history. Justice had to be served. At Nuremberg, the surviving Nazi leaders were tried for crimes against humanity. For the first time in history, the world declared, no one, not even a head of state, is above the law. Pause, faint echo of a gavel hitting wood. The map of the world was redrawn. Germany was divided east under Soviet control, west under the Allies. The United Nations was born, built on the hope that such a war would never happen again. Yet even in victory, new fears arose. The atomic bomb, unleashed on Hiroshima and Nagasaki, showed mankind's terrible new power. The Cold War began in the same ashes that Hitler's war had left behind. Voice softens, calm and reflective. But amid the destruction, there was resilience. Nations rebuilt. Families returned. The children of war grew up dreaming of peace, and the memory of those who died, soldiers, civilians, the innocent, became the foundation for a new world. From the ruins of Berlin to the rubble of Tokyo, humanity stood at a crossroads, to rebuild, to remember, and to rise again. Emotional orchestral swell begins. The story of World War II is not just one of conquest and destruction. It is the story of endurance, of people who refuse to be broken, of a world that, despite its darkest hour, found the strength to begin anew. Voice closes soft and reverent, and as the smoke of war faded into history, one truth remained eternal: evil may rise, but it can never rule forever. Music fades, sound of wind, then silence.